What if I told you everything you think you know about prehistoric humans is wrong? They weren't dumb, dirty, or barely human. They were smarter and intelligent than we ever imagined. You know the image. Everyone does. Hunched figures in animal skins, grunting over fires, dragging clubs through dirt, barely more than animals themselves. Smart enough to survive, maybe, but too simple to truly think. Too crude to feel, too primitive to be anything like us. That's the story we grew up with, the story in textbooks, in museums, in every cartoon and movie that showed our ancient ancestors as one step removed from apes. And it made sense, didn't it? Because if they were truly human like us, if they were intelligent, creative, emotional, then why did they live in caves? Why didn't they build cities? Why didn't they write? The answer seemed obvious. They couldn't. They weren't capable. But here's what nobody told you. That story, every part of it, it's wrong. Not just incomplete, not just outdated, wrong. In the last 2 decades, archaeologists have unearthed something that should have made headlines everywhere. Evidence so profound, so undeniable, that it shatters everything we thought we knew about prehistoric humans. And yet most people still carry the old story in their heads. Because changing what we believe about the past means changing what we believe about ourselves, about intelligence, about civilization, about what it means to be human. So let me show you what they found. 30,000 years ago, in what is now the Czech Republic, someone died. A person. And their community didn't just bury them. They dressed the body in clothing woven from thousands of hand-sewn beads, intricate patterns, symbolic designs, hours and hours of labor just to honor one person's death. That's not survival behavior. That's love. In a cave in Iraq, archaeologists found the skeleton of a Neanderthal man. He was elderly, severely disabled, multiple injuries. He couldn't hunt, couldn't gather food, couldn't defend himself, and yet he lived for years after his injuries, maybe decades. Someone fed him, cared for him, kept him alive, not because he was useful, but because he mattered. That's not primitive, that's civilization. But it gets stranger. In 2008, researchers discovered something in a South African cave that shouldn't exist, shouldn't be possible. Ochre, ground into powder, mixed with bone marrow and heated charcoal, stored in abalone shells. It was paint, a chemical compound, a manufactured technology. And it was 75,000 years old. 75,000! Modern humans supposedly started developing complex cognition around 50,000 years ago. That's what the textbooks said. That's when the Great Leap Forward happened. That's when we became us. Except, this paint was older, much older. Which means for 25,000 years before we thought humans were capable of abstract thought, they were already creating, already experimenting, already asking, what if I combine this with that? That's not instinct, that's science. But that wasn't even the most unsettling part. In 2015, deep in a cave system in France, archaeologists found structures, not natural formations, structures, walls made of broken stalagmites, arranged in circles, built deliberately. They were 176,000 years old. Not Homo sapiens, Neanderthals. Think about that. Neanderthals, the species we've used as shorthand for stupid for over a century, were building underground structures before modern humans even existed in Europe. Structures for what? We don't know. Ritual spaces maybe, meeting places, shelters from predators or weather. But here's what we do know. You don't build in the dark, hundreds of meters underground, unless you can plan, unless you can communicate complex ideas, unless you can think abstractly about space and time and purpose. And yet, we spent 100 years calling them brutes. Why? In Spain, researchers found shells, painted shells, worn as jewelry. Nothing unusual about that, right? Humans have worn jewelry for thousands of years. Except these shells were Neanderthal, and they were 50,000 years old. In Gibraltar, they found eagle talons, carefully cut, polished, arranged to be worn. In Croatia, they found musical instruments, flutes carved from bone. These weren't just functional tools. These were art, expression, culture. Neanderthals didn't just survive. They decorated themselves. They made music. They had aesthetics. And if they had aesthetics, they had opinions, preferences, individual taste. They had identity. But the most disturbing discovery came from DNA. When scientists finally sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, they expected to find a distant cousin, a separate branch of humanity that went extinct because they couldn't compete with us. What they found instead was us. If you're of European or Asian descent, 1 to 4% of your DNA is Neanderthal. Not similar to Neanderthal, is Neanderthal. Which means our ancestors didn't just encounter them, they lived with them, formed communities with them, had children with them, loved them. For tens of thousands of years, multiple species of humans coexisted, not at war, not in competition, together. And then, around 40,000 years ago, all the other species disappeared. Only we remained. We don't know why. Climate change, maybe? Disease? Random chance? Or maybe something darker. Something we did. Something we don't want to examine too closely. Let's talk about medicine. In 2013, archaeologists in Sudan found a 4,000-year-old skull. Nothing unusual at first, except when they looked closer, they saw marks, precise cuts in the bone, surgery, dental surgery specifically, an abscessed tooth removed with tools, 4,000 years ago. But that's not prehistoric, you might say. That's ancient Egypt. That's civilization. Fine, let's go further back. In France, they found a 15,000-year-old skeleton, a young person. Their arm had been amputated, surgically, cleanly, with knowledge of blood flow and infection control. And they survived, for years. Someone knew how to cut through bone without killing the patient, knew how to prevent infection, knew how to care for them during recovery. That's not luck, that's medicine. 15,000 years ago. But even that isn't the oldest. In Borneo, researchers found a skeleton, 31,000 years old. Left leg amputated in childhood, and the person lived into adulthood. Surgery, anesthesia probably, post-operative care, physical rehabilitation. 31,000 years ago. We didn't invent medicine. We inherited it, and that was unacceptable. So they reconstructed Neanderthals as bent, knuckle-dragging, slope-browed cavemen, even though the skeletons showed nothing of the sort. The first full Neanderthal skeleton they analyzed, it was elderly, suffering from severe arthritis. Of course it was hunched. But that reconstruction became the template. That image became truth. And once an idea enters the culture, it's almost impossible to remove. Even when the evidence changed, the story didn't. Because we wanted to believe it. We wanted to believe that we, modern humans, were special, that we were the pinnacle, that every human who came before us was just a rough draft. But the data kept contradicting us. In Turkey, they found Göbekli Tepe, massive stone structures, intricate carvings, built 11,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers. We thought cities came first, then religion. We thought you needed agriculture, surplus, hierarchy. But these people built temples before they built homes. They gathered by the thousands to carve and arrange stones that weighed tons. No writing, no wheels, no metal. Just human hands, human minds, human belief. In 2021, researchers analyzed ochre from a cave in South Africa. Not just ochre, a toolkit, grinding stones, mixing bowls, storage containers, a paint factory. 100,000 years old. Not a one-time thing, not an accident, an industry. These weren't people struggling to survive. These were people with surplus time, surplus resources, surplus creativity. They were thriving. And maybe that's the hardest part to accept. Not that they were intelligent. We can accept that now. The evidence is overwhelming. But that they might have been happy. We imagine prehistory as brutal, short, nasty, a desperate scramble for survival. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Hunter-gatherers had more leisure time than modern humans, more diverse diets, stronger social bonds, lower rates of infectious disease. They knew the names of hundreds of plants, could track animals across miles, could predict weather, seasons, migrations. They could navigate by stars, create fire in the rain, build shelter from nothing. Could you? We call them primitive because they didn't have cities, didn't have writing, didn't have technology. But they had knowledge we've forgotten, skills we've lost, a connection to the natural world we can't comprehend. They could survive in environments that would kill us in days. So who's really more advanced? Here's what we know now. Prehistoric humans weren't prototypes. They weren't practice runs for us. They were us, fully, completely, just in a different context. They loved, they created, they wondered, they mourned, they looked at the stars and asked why. They painted in caves not because they were primitive, but because the caves were sacred, because they understood something we've forgotten, that art isn't decoration, it's communication, with each other, with the future, with something larger than ourselves. When you see a handprint on a cave wall 30,000 years old, you're not looking at primitive scratching. You're looking at a message. I was here. I existed. I mattered. And they were right. They did matter. Because without them, without their knowledge, their resilience, their stubborn refusal to give up, we wouldn't exist. We don't descend from the strongest humans or the smartest. We descend from the ones who cared for the injured, who shared food, who passed down knowledge, who looked at a child who couldn't walk and said, "We'll carry you." That's the real story of human evolution. Not domination, cooperation. Not survival of the fittest, survival of the kindest. We were never meant to be alone. We were never meant to conquer. We were meant to belong. And maybe that's the lesson we've forgotten, the one they knew all along. They weren't the ones who needed to evolve. We are.